Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's keynote address at the American Encounters Lewis and Clark, the People and the Land Conference. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, could I ask Bob Bergantino of Montana Tech to come up to the stage? I hear he's in the audience. Where is he? There he is. At the annual convention of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, which was held last month in Vancouver, Washington, Bob Bergantino was awarded the foundation's Appreciation Award as a cartographer and student of historical and modern surveying and for compiling all of the expedition's campsites. Bob couldn't be in Vancouver last month, but he's here tonight, and I'm proud on behalf of the foundation to present this appreciation award to you.
Thank you very much.
He knows the Lewis and Clark campgrounds in Montana down to the rocks, down to the gravel swirls, I'll tell you. Well, I'm Harry Fritz from the History Department here, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Gary Moulton, the man who knows more about the journals of Lewis and Clark than any other living person. It's safe to say, I think, that he's familiar with every jot and tittle, every swirl and squiggle in the entire manuscript corpus. You see, he's an editor, and even if he didn't care much for Lewis and Clark, it's his job to see that their story gets told the way they wanted it to be told. Now, Gary Moulton is a professor of history at the University of Nebraska, and he previously edited the papers of the Cherokee Chief John Ross, and he wrote a biography of Chief John Ross. I'm happy to say that that biography is required reading in a history class here at the University of Montana this semester. I certainly hope it's bringing in some royalties for our keynote speaker. Class of 200, Gary, so maybe those dimes add up. Now, Professor Moulton's familiarity with the journals of Lewis and Clark has resulted in the publication of a number of I think, very sensitive, problem-solving articles about the expedition. In a way, he's cleared up a lot of the murky areas, he's answered a lot of questions, and damn it, he's taken a lot of a mystery out of the expedition, I'll tell you, of Lewis and Clark. Just peruse, if you will, the Mammoth Atlas, the first volume in the projected 11-volume journal series, the Atlas of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which is about 14 inches wide and about 20 inches high, and reproduces most of the maps in the original size. And take a look at the next 6 narrative volumes which have appeared, and you'll see the scholarly exactitude that he brings to this task. And before he started out, I myself wondered if we really needed a new edition of the journals. I mean, after all, what's wrong with the old one? Thwaites, or even Cowes and Biddle, or Quaife and Osgood. It's our job to look at all these different editions and figure out what happened on the expedition. And I was quickly persuaded to the contrary when I saw the high, modern, professional editorial standards that our speaker brings to his work. It's an educational experience to read those journals, not just what the explorers wrote, but what the editor has to say about what they wrote. Gary Moulton has created a monument for our times, a monument which will stand forever, or at least for another 100 years, and he can be proud of it. Now, I've often wondered just how Gary Moulton came to learn so much about the expedition of Lewis and Clark, and I finally figured it out. He went along. He was there. Now, maybe he's not that old, but he has grown gray in the service of scholarship. Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker, a fine scholar, a fine gentleman, professor and editor, Gary Moulton. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, you can sit back and relax. I have no political agenda. I am not here to sermonize. I am not here to moralize. And especially, I'm not here to pulverize Lewis and Clark. Ladies and gentlemen, I come to praise Lewis and Clark. They are my heroes. I don't care what anybody says. So just sit back and relax, okay? So let's go ahead and get the slideshow started. We were having a little trouble with it earlier. If that comes up, I'll just come down and bang on it a few times. Well, to look at them, you wouldn't think they were genocidal megalomaniacs, would you? Look like pretty nice guys. Well, enough of that. I'm going to get into my talk. We've heard enough about Lewis and Clark that I'm not going to tell you much about the men themselves or about the expedition. We're not here tonight to follow them on the trail. We're to follow them on an intellectual journey, the journey that will take us to look at the journals of the expedition, how they were written, how they were so carefully preserved over the 2.5 years or so they were out on the expedition. Meriwether Lewis was chosen by Jefferson to be the head of this expedition for a number of reasons, not the least of which was because Jefferson saw that Lewis had some literary abilities. He thought that Lewis could come back and gather the documents that they would produce, the journals and diaries of this expedition, and put them together as a report to the nation. And Jefferson then had confidence in Lewis as a young, vigorous Army officer who was competent in every way to lead them across the continent, come back and write up a report. So then part of the strategy of getting Lewis was because of his literary abilities. In 1809, 3 years after the expedition ended, Lewis took his life in the backwoods of Tennessee. Now there's still a group of people who would say perhaps he was murdered for the money in his possession or for some other reason, but most scholars today accept the suicide theory without question. During this time, from 1806 to 1809, he had not written one word. He had all the journals in his possession at this time, and luckily, especially for me, those journals were preserved, taken to Jefferson, and now they were handed over to his co-commander, William Clark, who did not feel competent in this literary project that was handed him. Now, Lewis and Clark have been contrasted over the years almost to the point of stereotyping them. Lewis, the moody, introspective individual; Clark, the hail fellow, label-grabbing friend, the one who would more often remain on the boat with his buddies while Lewis was off doing naturalist work on his own. But Clark did not feel competent in this literary task. So he went out looking for a ghostwriter, a helper, someone to help him along in his journey to get these expedition published, these expedition records. And he turned to a literary figure in Philadelphia, Nicholas Biddle, one of the richest men in the country at that time. The Biddle family was Mayflower descendants. They owned property and banks and all sorts of institutions around Philadelphia and remained a wealthy and prominent family in Philadelphia today. He wasn't really interested in taking up the task. He didn't need the money. He didn't need the prestige. But Clark visited with him. He went to Clark's home and the home of his wife, Julia, in Fincastle, Virginia, and there he convinced him to take on this job. And he handed over to Biddle all the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition for Biddle to craft into a report to the public for the work that they had done. Biddle took these 18 or 20 or so notebooks with him to his home north of Philadelphia on the Brandywine River at Andalusia. I know if I were working in a setting like this, that I could create volumes illustrious as Biddle's. My working conditions are not quite so comfortable, but we get the work done nonetheless. So here at his home in Andalusia, he began to pore over these journals, not to give the public a word-by-word account, but to rather craft them into a narrative, a paraphrase of what Lewis and Clark said into volumes that the public could read and understand what we had gotten in this Louisiana purchase and what the country was like beyond. Here are the journals he worked with. This particular one shows that Biddle himself began to write in the journals as he worked with them. Now, we will talk in a moment about the criticism Elliott Cowes has got for writing in the journals. Biddle did it also, but it's not received quite so much criticism. Partly that may be because he did not do it quite so much as Elliott Cowes. Moreover, he may have done it sitting there with Clark. And Clark would have simply said, here, write this in. That'll clarify it for you. Most often, Biddle's comments are in red ink, and you can see them up toward the top of this page, so they sort of stand out. And the handwriting is different enough that it usually jumps out at you. So he wrote occasionally in the journals himself. So I always say that with Lewis and Clark, we have to read between the lines in more ways than one, because we have these fellows who are writing in the journals. Not only Biddle and Cowes, but some other persons we simply can't identify. So Biddle then took these journals to Andalusia and worked with them. These are what they look like. For the most part, they're like the red books on the right. That's what they've come to be called, the red books. The others are we have a couple like the books on the left. They're called the marbled covered books because of the marbling on the cover. There are a couple of the notebooks that are known as the leather-bound books, like the one in the center. But for the most part, they're like the red books. Gilt-edged notebooks, about 5 by 8 in size, that open like a stenographer's notebook from end to end. They're uniform of about 154 pages or so each, blank pages on which Lewis and Clark entered the daily events and their observations along the way. These are at the American Philosophical Society where I photographed them. Here's a close-up of Clark's entry for Monday, May the 14th, 1804. Down toward the bottom of the page, you see there that he says, I set out at 4 o'clock p.m. in the presence of many of the neighboring inhabitants, and proceeded on, and oh, how they love to use that phrase, and proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri. Gentle breeze, Gentlebrace. Well, Clark's misspelling and creative spelling is renowned, isn't it? The Indian tribe Sioux, he spelled 27 different ways in the journals. Recently, I tested another word to see how good his spelling was, and of the 11 times he used the term potato, he spelled it correctly 9 times. Well, he was never vice president. He was only a captain in the United States. Here's a close-up of that particular passage. After Biddle had done his work and created this paraphrase, he deposited all these notebooks in the American Philosophical Society, the red building here in the foreground. To orient you a little bit, to the left of that is the historic district, Independence Hall, and the library itself sits within the historic district in Philadelphia. And probably some of you visited it back in earlier years when the Lewis and Clark Foundation went there. Well, then these journals then were all collected there, and that was in 1816 after he had finished his work. They went to the American Philosophical Society because there was no National Archives. That was not created until 1936. And since Jefferson was president of the American Philosophical Society, he suggested that that would be an appropriate place to put them. This is what Biddle created, a 2-volume work published in 1814. He boiled down the more than 1 million words that Lewis and Clark wrote on the expedition to a 2-volume standard text that would be the standard for the next 75 or 80 years. There was to be another volume, and we heard about that earlier. A man, Benjamin Smith Barton, was supposed to write it. He dillied and he dallied and he died and he never got it done. So what we have in Biddle is mostly a romantic adventure. And that's what's come down to us today about the Lewis and Clark expedition. It's mainly filled with stories of their encounters with the Indians, of the route that they followed. Biddle had some interest in Indians, so he filled the journals with those sort of episodes. He was intent on giving the public a view of these new lands, so he filled it with that. But nothing of this massive scientific work that Lewis and Clark were about. Nothing much about the botany and the zoology and the meteorology and the geology and all these other things that they were involved in. So the generation that saw these books then got a sort of a shortened view of what Lewis and Clark were all about. And that's one of the reasons for the new edition, to help awaken the public even further than has been known about the scientific work of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And it was this man who first did that. Elliott Cowes was an ornithologist, probably the leading birdman of his day, and some would say one of the leading birdmen that America's ever produced, along with Alexander Wilson and James John Audubon. And Cowes had had some experience with Lewis and Clark materials before, so he didn't come to it entirely unknowing of what was going on. Francis Harper, the publisher, asked Cowes to put out a re-edition, a reprint, a new printing of the Biddle edition. He was to take this 1814 edition that was now out of print in the 1890s and bring out a new one, and perhaps supply an index to that book and maybe a few clarifying footnotes. Now, when Cowes began to work with the Biddle edition, he thought he ought to see the original journals. He went to the Library of Congress in his home in Washington, D.C., in his hometown there, and found that there were no journals there. Finally discovered them at Philadelphia in the American Philosophical Society. And Cowes made something of the fact that he had discovered the lost journals. Now, the American Philosophical Society doesn't like that term because they said they were never lost. We had them here and we're keeping them safely, ready to be used at any time. And they can haul out notes to show that they were used in the 1840s and 50s and right along. But what Elliott Cowes did do was to rediscover the journals and ignite a public interest in it that's never dimmed in all these years since his re-edition of the Biddle narrative came out. Cowes took the journals with him back to Washington, D.C. The Philosophical Society allowed them to take him to his home in Washington, D.C. and work with them. He not only worked with them, he worked over them. He wrote incredibly, interlinearly in the journals. Since he was interested in the birds, he would really get down on the birds. Here he's written in the scientific name for the American avocet on this page. He not only wrote on the journals, he was careful to put them all in a chronological order. He named each of the journals Codex A, Codex B, Codex C by chronology. If some were out of order, he would simply take pages out and put them in order. If pages were a little bit torn or foxed or yellowed, he would take his scissors and clip them very nicely and neatly. Where he found a page torn, he would lick a stamp and stick on there to hold it together. All of these things, very destructive of the journals. He handled them much like you or I might handle a Xeroxed copy today. So historians and librarians have been very critical of cows for this reason. And the American Philosophical Society will never let the journals leave there again. Well, I have them all on microfilm and work with them at the University of Nebraska, where I'm headquartered. Well, when cows begin to read these journals and discover, especially the scientific material like the birds, he became greatly enamored with them and began to quote them in his book. He would add lengthy footnotes quoting from the journals as well as supplying information about what was going on. Maybe not a representative page, but sort of typical of cows is this one with 3 lines of text and 7/8 of the page footnotes. Cows would not only quote from the Lewis and Clark journals, but he would begin to tell old war stories. Ah, yes, I remember when I went through here in 1874 and we did this and that. So you have quite a bit of cows in the footnotes as well. Well, in spite of my criticisms of him in his editing and in his handling of the journals, I've got to say that he did a magnificent job in his footnotes of alerting the public to the scientific possibilities of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well, he doubled Biddle's narrative, went from 2 volumes to 4 volumes because his footnotes grew and grew and grew. So what Francis Harper had asked him to do, he went far beyond. It really came to this man, Reuben Gold Thwaites, in 1904-05 at the centennial of the expedition to bring out the very thing that Jefferson may have had in mind all along, a complete edition of every known journal of Lewis and Clark exactly as they had written it. Now, Thwaites knew about the notebooks at the Philosophical Society. As a matter of fact, he's the one who tattled on cows. When he got them, he said, "Look what this man has done." And that sealed it right there, and they're never going out again. But he thought there might be additional materials in other places. So he began to contact people and look for additional Lewis and Clark materials. He went to the descendants of William Clark, this woman, Julia Clark Voorhees, and her daughter, Eleanor Glasgow Voorhees, who were the proprietary descendants of William Clark, and asked if he had papers that might be valuable in touching on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And they let him go through their grandfather and great-grandfather's paper in their home in New York, and he discovered not only personal and public letters, but he also discovered Lewis and Clark materials from the expedition. Red books, just like the red books in Philadelphia. They fit hand in glove, 5x8, red-bound, gilt-edged, 154-page notebooks exactly like the ones in Philadelphia, without Cow's handwriting on them, of course. The question then comes up, why did Clark keep these materials? When Biddle was working with his materials, when Jefferson was looking to bring all the materials together, why didn't Clark turn them over to the American Philosophical Society? These notebooks largely duplicate material in Lewis's notebooks for the same period. As a matter of fact, they're almost exact copies. This was during a period when they were out at Fort Clatsop on the Oregon coast. And my suspicion is that Clark and Lewis decided that they ought to have a duplicate copy as they returned. No ship showed up, no way to send the journal safely by ship, so we're going to have to carry them back over the mountains. Let's make duplicate copies so if one gets lost, we have this other material. And since some of the best and most comprehensive writing was done there at Fort Clatsop during their leisure, they copied that part over. So Clark felt no need to give these to Biddle and simply kept them himself. But they do have some additional materials, enough so that Thwaites added them to his edition, and they will, of course, be in the new edition that I'm working on now. Other little odds and ends pieces. There were detachment orders for the enlisted men. There were little notebooks that were sort of field books that complemented the red books. So little odds and ends that just churned up here from the expedition, all interesting material. One of the most interesting was the elkskin bound journal, as it's called. Sheets of paper which Lewis and Clark cut the size of notebook paper, sewed up with sinew, bound with elkskin, and used as a field book. Now, when this was discovered by Thwaites, the opinion was brought forward that perhaps this was one of many, that perhaps now we're seeing a pattern here for Lewis and Clark, that they wrote first in these rude notebooks and then later transferred the information to the red books. And the red books are so nice and clean and neat, it's easy to jump to that conclusion. And then the opinion is that perhaps if this is one of many, for every line in the red book, there's a duplicate line written in a field book. So there must be hundreds of other pages that are either lost or destroyed, thrown away, or somehow mislaid. I'm not of that opinion. I think this is a special volume. There may have been other field notes such as this that they used from time to time, but I think this is a special circumstance. The dates on this notebook coincide almost exactly with one of the most difficult portions of the route, the portion of the route that we are so nearby tonight, when they came up this Bitterroot Valley and then went down the Lolo Trail. I believe that what they probably did was sealed up the red books at that point in their little tin canisters, packed them away very safely on the horses or in their knapsacks, and said, we'll just ride in this one during this period. And then once they got down in the valley, they laid it aside and went back to the red books again and simply copied that material into one of the red books. This is my assumption. We really don't know, but it seems to me an explanation that keeps us from having to discover thousands upon thousands of duplicate words and give them such a job of writing that way they seemingly never could have completed on their trip. Well, when Thwaites had ended his work with the Voorhees family and obtained them from them, they deposited these notebooks in the Missouri Historical Society at St. Louis, and that's where they are today. And I've traveled to St. Louis, and I traveled to Philadelphia after I finished my work with the microfilm to compare our transcripts against the originals at these institutions and others that I'm going to be showing you. He also had other notebooks to work with. This is a short notebook that he had there at Madison, Wisconsin, where he was superintendent of the Historical Society. It's the Journal of Charles Floyd. It only goes from May 14th to August 18th. He died 2 days later. The only member of the expedition to die, perhaps of a ruptured appendix. Lewis and Clark gave him the best medical care and sympathy and help that they could. They probably exacerbated his condition, though. They gave him strong laxatives and they bled him during that time, weakened his condition, and probably hastened his death. Had he been in Philadelphia or Boston or anywhere else, he would have gotten much the same treatment and would as surely have died in the East as well as he did there. So his journal, Thwaites had available to him, and he worked with it and was going to add it to the corpus of materials in his edition. You can see here the handwriting of a rough frontier army sergeant, Sergeant Charles Floyd. You can see that it's had some wear. It's been around the country a couple of times. Probably spelled about as well as Clark. And this journal today remains at the State Historical Society of Wisconsin in Madison. Thwaites also had available to him another journal, the only journal of a private that's available to us or to Thwaites, the Journal of Private Joseph Whitehouse. Whitehouse's journal was in the hands of a collector at that point, but he allowed Thwaites to work with it. And so Thwaites wanted to add Whitehouse's journals to the other enlisted men and the captain's journals. Whitehouse's journal starts May 14th, as do the other, but ends in November of 1805 when they're out on the Oregon coast. And there was the assumption that perhaps there was more to this journal, that he didn't just quit writing, that more of it was somewhere, again, lost, mislaid, or something else. And so he published in his edition all that he could of Whitehouse's journal. And here's a look at it. You can see it's even had rougher service than that of Charles Floyd. In 1966, a gentleman walked into Sessler's bookstore in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and said, "I'm interested in Western Americana. Do you have any books or rare manuscripts that I might see?" And the proprietor said, "I have a journal from the Lewis and Clark expedition." He said, "I'll take 2 or 3 of those," incredulous that any such thing could exist. Surprisingly enough, he did have a journal from the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Journal of Private Joseph Whitehouse. Now, what he had was a fair copy bound like this that said the journal from Captain Lewis and Clark's expedition written by Joseph Whitehouse. And when you look at it, you see it's neatly written, carefully penned. Perhaps when Whitehouse got back to St. Louis with the party, he hired a copyist to take his rough notes that we saw there and neatly pen them in another notebook with the idea that he might publish them someday himself. What's interesting about this fair copy, this second copy, is that it extends the narrative. It doesn't end in November of 1805. It goes until April of 1806. And what's so nice is that we can check the copyist to see how well that person did in the early stages, to give us confidence about what they copied that we don't have in the original. So we get an extension here of several months. Thwaites did not have this to work with. It only became available in 1966, and it will appear for the first time in the new edition in volume 10 that I'll be working with in the next year or so. Newberry Library had already purchased, Newberry Library in Chicago had purchased the original Journal of Private Joseph Whitehouse back in Thwaites' time, and in 1966, when that became available, they scrounged up some money and purchased the copy. So both of them are there together at Newberry Library in Chicago, and I'll be traveling there to look at that in the next year or so. Thwaites doubled cows. We have 2 for Biddle, 4 for cows, 8 for Thwaites. Well, you're expecting 16 from me, aren't you? Well, you're not gonna get it. We're stopping at 11. So here then was a comprehensive edition at the centennial of the expedition, all the known manuscripts of the time. Was that everything? Well, Thwaites seemed to think so, that they now had the full corpus of Lewis and Clark's journals. We know better, don't we, because I've told you about this find in 1966. But there were other discoveries before that. And we have to go back to Andalusia. We have to go back to the Brandywine River north of Philadelphia here. And listen to the grandchildren as they go through the papers of their grandfather. Why, this doesn't look like grandfather's stuff. I wonder what this is. And they began investigating, and they discovered that Biddle had kept some of the Lewis and Clark materials in his personal library. And we wonder why. Well, there may be an explanation for this notebook. This we call the Eastern Journal. It's a little notebook kept by Lewis from August of 1803 till December of 1803, as he was going down the Ohio and up the Mississippi to set up winter camp before they set out in the spring of 1804 on the expedition. So really this is sort of a pre-notebook, one that wouldn't figure in his narrative account. So there was no need to do anything with that, so he just kept that one. This one starts August the 31st, when Lewis is setting out here from Pittsburgh to go down the Ohio. This first page is sort of interesting. A couple of people got interested in his air gun, you know, that repeating air gun that he had. So they were testing it out on the keelboat and shot a woman in the head who was standing nearby. They rushed over to her, and she seemed to recover and got up and was all right. But so much for the accuracy of our forefathers, huh? This is a very interesting journal. It used to be called Lewis's Journal. We call it the Eastern Journal now because Clark picked it up after Lewis met with him, and he did much of the later writing. And it goes from August 31st, 1803 till December 13th, 1803, when they set up their winter encampment at this little Dubois or Wood River across from St. Louis. So it was a new discovery that no one had known about. When the grandchildren found this in 1914, they were sort of elated about it. Probably more important than the Eastern Journal is this 3-volume journal of John Ordway, another sergeant from the expedition, another set of materials that was entirely unknown. Again, the question arises, why did Biddle keep this? Why didn't he turn it over to the Philosophical Society? He may have used it to help him write part of his narrative. He would refer to it along with the journals of Lewis and Clark to write his narrative. It's a great journal. It's one of the best of the enlisted men's journals, so I'm sure he used it extensively. Why didn't he turn it over? Well, he probably felt like you had this material in Lewis and Clark's journals at the Philosophical Society. You didn't know. They didn't need this set of notebooks. The greater question is, why didn't he return it to Clark when Clark kept writing him letters and say, send me that notebook that I paid good money for to John Ordway? And Biddle never did return those notebooks to Clark from oversight or whatever, and they remained among his personal papers. Now, Ordway's is one of the best of the enlisted men's journals. He was a faithful journal keeper. He put an entry down for every one of the 863 days that the men were out. So it's a comprehensive enlisted man's view of the Lewis and Clark expedition by an intelligent individual who would look at things in a deeper way than other enlisted men who would simply write, it rained today, we went 4 miles, and this sort of thing. So he has comments about what's going on. It's going to appear in volume 9 of the new edition. And here's a look at what the pages are like. Fairly clean, easy to read, not much difficulty in doing the editing job on these 3 notebooks. These were published in 1916 by the successor at Madison to Reuben Goldthwaite's Milo Milton Quaife. They came out in a special publication in 1916 in Wisconsin. and they returned over rather by the Biddle family to the American Philosophical Society, and they have joined the corpus of the Lewis and Clark materials there in Philadelphia. Well, was that everything? Well, no. In 1954, in this house at 117 Farrington Street in St. Paul, Minnesota, in this attic up here, some grandchildren, is this a classic story? Some grandchildren were going through the papers of their grandfather, who was a Civil War general, because they had told the Minnesota Historical Society that they wanted to donate their papers to the Minnesota Historical Society, and so they were cleaning out the attic, and their grandfather here, a Civil War general, his papers were going to the Minnesota Historical Society. And they were working away here at this desk, getting the papers, and in this particular pigeonhole, they found papers stuffed in there, wrapped in an old newspaper. They pulled it out. This is Lucille Kane, who's a curator at the Minnesota Historical Society. Pulled out the papers, opened them up, and they didn't look like their grandfather's papers. They didn't look like Civil War papers. They were 67 loose sheets of paper that William Clark had written on, detailing the activities of the Corps of Discovery at Camp Du Bois. And they were entirely new and unknown to the world. No one had known that they kept journals during this interim period. We had a little Eastern journal, a little pre-journal, and then we have the red books that start us out May 14 and the enlisted men's journals. But this fills then the last gap, this period of time at Camp Du Bois while they're outfitting the expedition and getting ready to go upriver. There are letter sheets of paper on which they not only wrote the activities of the day as they passed the time, they drew keel boats, they did all sorts of doodles on them. Here's a page from it. The first page they wrote sideways, upside down. Someone seems to have set a cup of coffee up in one corner, spilled his ink bottle and wiped it off in another. And so these papers are some of the most difficult to read and to edit of all the materials of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well, it was quickly discovered then it was Lewis and Clark papers. What's interesting about them is, I remember that I said that the Eastern Journal ends December 13. You'll notice the date there, Saturday the 13th of December. It begins at the very date the other one ends. It ends May 14, 1804, as the red books take off. There are a few other scattered pieces that take them on upriver, but they become less and less, and more the red books take over. So they fill that little niche. Now, what happened to these papers and what makes them interesting beyond their valuable worth here as Lewis and Clark's is they got caught up in a court case. As soon as this discovery was made by the Minnesota Historical Society and scholars, there began to appear notices in the newspaper, articles about them that said priceless documents from the Lewis and Clark expedition discovered. And priceless has a way of focusing your attention. And the family came forward and said, we intended to give you the papers of our grandfather, but we want those Lewis and Clark documents back. We didn't intend to give you those. So they had hopes to sell them and make money on them. The Minnesota Historical Society balked and said, we're keeping them. The contract was the papers that were there, we'll take them. And a lawyer for the Minnesota Historical Society sat down to try to decide who claimants might be. And they wrote down the government of the United States because, it was a government expedition. And the Minnesota Historical Society, this family in St. Paul, and the federal government walked in and said, we'll take those papers and put them in the National Archives. So the Minnesota Historical Society backed off. But one member of the family said, I don't think my grandfather stole those papers. I think they had them for some legitimate reason. Now, we simply do not know why they were in that attic in St. Paul, Minnesota. Here's the conjecture, folks. This Civil War general, after the war was over in the 1870, was commissioned to go around to different forts that they were closing down to get the materials out of them and to bring them back to Washington. One of the posts that he closed down was at Lawrence, Kansas. And not only were military records there, but it appears that the papers of the regional Indian superintendency were also at the fort in Lawrence, Kansas. And Clark had been for many years superintendent of Indian Affairs. So the thought is that these superintendency papers, and some of Clark's superintendency papers were there, that these loose sheets got confused with those. He picked them up and unknowingly separated them as something distinct without realizing their worth, simply packed them away with his personal papers, and they were forgotten. There's no evidence that he ever tried to sell them to make money. We simply can't explain why he had them, but eventually they appear in the attic in St. Paul. So here they are in 1953, the Minnesota Historical Society, and it goes to court. The family then is resisting the federal government taking the papers. It went to court. The case lasted 4 days, and the judge ruled in favor of the family. Because of the sort of documents they were before May 14, before the expedition officially started, because many of them were written on letter-type paper with addresses on the back, looking like they had at one point been mailed to Clark's family in Kentucky and picked up by him later. All of this evidence seemed to say to the judge that these were pre-expeditionary materials, and possession was 9/10 of the law. The family had possession of them. They hadn't intended to give them to the Minnesota Historical Society, and so they got them back. They quickly sold them to a dealer. A dealer sold them to a collector. This man, William Frederick Beinecke. Beinecke was a rare book collector and a manuscript collector. He had built a rare book library, the Beinecke Library at Yale University. He simply donated those papers to the New Haven Institution, and that's where those 67 sheets are today. They were published in 1964 as the Field Notes of William Clark by this man, Ernest Staples Osgood, and it is the most recent publication in 1964 before we got started on the new edition in 1979. So as you can see, the new edition doesn't come about because of any new great discovery. It comes about largely because of the scattered nature of the materials and this multiple of publications that makes it difficult for persons to get at the Lewis and Clark story. So we have come in the 1980s and 90s to give a comprehensive account, to give a verbatim edition, the very thing that Jefferson had intended, that Thwaites had tried to bring to fruition, and that's now all coming together in the 1990s. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Now, as has been our custom, I'll be glad to take some questions from the audience if you have them.
What's the likelihood that there's another journal out there somewhere?
There's good likelihood. For instance, we know perhaps that Joseph Whitehouse's other volume of his original journals out there, or perhaps the rest of the materials from the fair copy. I don't think that all these great gaps in Lewis's writing presupposes that there are more Lewis manuscripts out there. I think that pretty much for Lewis, what you see is what you have, that we won't find anymore. But I'm not going to say that patently because all these people have been proved wrong over the years. So there is a good chance that there are additional journals out there somewhere to be found.
Have the descendants of all the people who participated been
Pretty thoroughly searched now, yes. All the attics have been gone through, I think. Although, as you know, 47 letters of William Clark to his brother Jonathan were recently discovered in a trunk in a home in Louisville, Kentucky, 5 of them dating from the expedition. So there's still materials associated with the expedition that are coming out and being discovered.
How about Patrick Gadd?
I dropped 2 or 3 things because I thought it was getting so long. Patrick Gass did publish his journal in 1807, beat Lewis and Clark to the punch on that, and his was the first edition out, and by the time Biddle got finished with his work, Gass's journal had already gone through 3 or 4 printings. So it is another one that I just left out because I thought it was getting too lengthy. And now I've said it anyway.
Is there any hard evidence that Pryor's or Fraser's journal?
These are other potentials. We do know that other enlisted men kept journals like Robert Fraser. There's evidence in Lewis and Clark's account about other members of the party keeping journals. So beyond the missing extra notes of White House, men like Fraser may have a journal too. But again, where would you begin to look? And I think most of these places that are obvious and men that are obvious like Fraser, those things have been hunted about as thoroughly as they can. Yes, sir?
You mentioned Bernard DeVoto's edition.
The question was about Bernard DeVoto's edition. Bernard DeVoto's was a condensation of Thwaites' edition. He simply took Thwaites' edition and condensed it to a 1-volume account. All the other 1-volume editions that you see, that by Meticulous and other persons, have all been a condensation of the Thwaites' edition. So I simply thought I took care of those sort of things when I talked about Thwaites.
Can you make any sort of estimate about what number or percentage of the men could have written?
Question was about
Literate.
right, how many of the men were literate in the party, and I simply don't know. They say in the journals that they ordered all the sergeants to keep journals, and I think it was a requirement to be a sergeant in the Army in that period that you be literate. But I don't know about the other men on the expedition, if they were or were not, so I'm not sure that we could speak to the potential of journals by knowing that sort of information. Yes?
Gary, if, be hypothetical, say you're done with the journals in 95 or 96, and let's say Fraser's in the light in 98, is there a mechanism in place through the University of Nebraska Press to issue a supplemental volume to the journals?
Well, the question is about if other materials are discovered after this edition's finished. If I'm still around, but from what Harry Fritz said, I may not be. I didn't know I deteriorated so much, Harry. Well, if I'm still around, I guess they'll totter me in and ask me to edit that. So there's not a mechanism in place, but I'm sure that if another journal was discovered, we would certainly want to put it in a comfortable format that would fit with the existing ones. One more question here, yes.
Yeah, I've always been curious that American history, general American history, lists the start of the expedition as being St. Charles, Missouri. But when I actually visited that area, I learned that they only spent 4 days in that location. And it struck me that the start of the expedition was really the Wood River camp. Is there any reason why St. Charles has gotten sort of the press as the actual start of the expedition?
The larger question here is, where did the expedition begin? And That's debated by every little community that could possibly have that honor. I think officially the idea is May 14, 1804, when they set out from Wood River. So that's why Illinois gets honor as being one of the 11 trail states, because they set out from Wood River. St. Charles would claim that honor perhaps because they were one of the last settlements before they went into the unknown or to the unsettled or wilderness region. So yes, they just spent a couple of days there. They went as far as St. Charles the first day to sort of shake themselves out and see how good they could do going upriver. And so then they spent a couple of days there tightening everything down to be sure it was going to work all right. And Lewis came up by horseback the next day or so. He had stayed behind to do some last-minute arrangements. So perhaps bringing Lewis up, getting refitted a little bit, perhaps they want to claim the title for that reason.
So that's where the two of them actually started.
That's right.
Nice.
Gary,
Yes.